Welcome to the second talk in this conference on contemporary moral theory and the problem of evil. I'm Michael Ray, and I'm chairing this session. Our speaker tonight is Steve Wykstra. Steve teaches at Calvin College. He got his PhD in the history and philosophy of science from the University of Pittsburgh in 1978. He taught at the University of Tulsa for about 6 years and then moved to Calvin College in 1985, where he has been ever since. He's written extensively on issues in the philosophy of religion and epistemology and philosophy of science, often at the intersection of these disciplines. My first exposure to Steve's work, interestingly enough, came in a course I took as an undergrad that was taught by Marilyn Adams during a quarter when Linda Zagzebski was visiting and auditing a seminar that I was sitting in on that was taught by Bob Adams. And we read this paper of Steve's that has been widely discussed and widely anthologized and has exerted, I think, a lot of influence on subsequent discussion of the problem of evil. It's a paper in which he lays out the sort of what's now called the skeptical theist strategy for solving the problem of evil. This has had a real influence on my thinking about the topic. I remember thinking that it was fundamentally correct, although I've admitted that this was also a time when I thought that Kant had said some true things too. But I still think that Steve was fundamentally correct. Maybe I shouldn't admit this in front of Marilyn, who might think that she failed as a teacher. But I learned a lot of other things.
Teacher, but not for that reason.
Okay. Anyways, I really respect and admire Steve's work on the problem of evil, and I'm looking forward to his talk tonight. The title of which is Beyond the Impasse, Contemporary Moral Theory and the Crisis of Skeptical Theism. Crisis? No, it was correct.
Thank you, Mike. So our invitation from Professor Sturba, hereafter Jim, is to explore whether current moral theory, saves several syllables from contemporary, so I'll use current, is relevant but a largely untapped resource for philosophers of religion working on the problem of evil. Philosophers working on the problem of evil. I'll call those evil workers from now on. In inviting us, Jim asked us to take a stand on this question. Is it relevant? And Jim proposed that we consider as one source of relevance the relation of trolley car cases to the so-called Pauline principle from St. Paul, which says, "Let us not do evil, that good may come of it." How you intone that, actually, I realized makes a difference to what it means, and I intoned it wrong, but I won't say it again. The Pauline principle underlies a more complex principle developed within Catholic moral theory, the so-called double effect principle. Jim's invitation included a background paper explaining how trolley car cases can be seen as mapping the limits of the Pauline principle and sort of morphing it into the double effect principle. I may have misunderstood that, but anyway, I will call this relationship making of Jim's the Pauline trolley line. This connecting, or for short, PTL. As one who knows little about moral theory, I accepted Jim's invitation with eagerness but anxiety. I was eager to explore moral theory, but was anxious that as a duffer I'd botch a lot. I found Jim's position paper very stimulating, and I will be grappling with it tonight. My stand on the question will be that moral theory is very relevant to the problem of evil, and that in the future I hope to draw on it much more than I have. In my talk, I will protest some aspects of Jim's discussion of the Pauline principle, but I do this only as a feisty apprentice to Jim. In part one of the paper, I explain Jim's Pauline trolley line, and as a novice apprentice, I use an insight from early Augustine to challenge Jim's way of expressing his Pauline trolley line. Early Augustine may not count as contemporary moral theory, but Augustine is a trailblazer in connecting moral theory to the problem of evil. He also gives common ground for Catholics and Calvinists, which is surely, for me here, a good thing to have. In part 2, I use an insight from Calvin, that's John Calvin, not Calvin College, to challenge something in Augustine's early argument and to add a new limit to the Pauline principle. The Pauline principle rightly forbids us to ever do evil that good may come of it, but contrary to Augustine, if Calvin is right, it does not forbid God to sometimes cause others to do evil. So we will refine the Pauline principle. In part 3, the main part of this paper, I try to use moral theory to find a way out of a crisis. Even those friendly to skeptical theism, Hudson, for example, worry that skeptical theism threatens a corrosive moral skepticism. Michael Bergman gives the best defense I know against this threat. But 2 years ago, at a conference here, my twin brother, Artsky, hijacked my place as a speaker and assaulted Bergman's defense. I saw no way to meet his arguments until last week. So tonight, I will briefly invite Artsky in for another attack on Bergman. I will then kick him out and share what I am glimpsing as a possible reply. If the reply works, it will make me a regular rider on Jim's Pauline trolley line. So, first, the Augustine trolley connection. Consider how Augustine opens on free choice of the will. It was written soon after his conversion, and in it Augustine works out his thoughts in a dialogue between two characters, Augustine and Devotius. I'll call the characters Augie and Evo. This will distance Augie, the character in the dialogue, from Augustine, the author of the dialogue. In the very first sentence, Augustine has Evo implore his teacher Augie, "Tell me, please, whether God is not the author of evil." To this, teacher Augie replies, "I will tell you, if you will first make clear what you mean by evil in your question. For we often use the word evil in two senses. Sometimes we use it to refer to the evil a man has done. Other times we use it to refer to the evil a man has undergone." So what are these two senses of evil? And since Augie, of course, speaks of the Latin word malus, which the translation turns into the English word evil, does that word, well, the English, I mean, have the same two senses? Augustine, that is Augie, merely gestures at two sorts of sentences. In some sentences, we speak of a person doing evil, called these agent sentences. In others, we speak of a person undergoing evil, called these patient sentences. This gesture does nothing to say what the two senses are. It doesn't even show there are two sentences. In a famous or infamous heavyweight fight, Mike Tyson bit a chunk off the ear of Evan Holyfield. Someone might say Tyson caused pain, Evan suffered pain. You have not used the word pain in two senses. Still, about the word evil in English and Latin, I take Augie to be absolutely right. And not having Augie spell it out, I take it as Augustine's way of inviting us to puzzle out why it's right. For the English, we need English old-fashioned enough to be close to the Latin roots. We need prose from the King James Bible, not Harry Potter. Our students know only the Harry Potter sense. Young Lord Voldemort killed 7 people to increase his magical power. Our students know what it means to say Voldemort's doings or deeds were evil. It means the deeds were morally wrong or very morally wrong. The patient sense is very different and no longer familiar. The typhoon this week has caused immense loss and suffering to the people of the Philippines. Our students, most of them, wouldn't say the Filipinos in many cities are suffering great evils. But the King James Bible does say this constantly. Job asks his friends, "Shall we receive good at the hand of the Lord and not receive evil?" God, speaking through the prophets, says things like, "It is I, the Lord your God, who has brought this evil upon you." To say that an event, in this second sense, evil is predicated not of event agents, but events. To say an event is a great evil is simply to say that it is an event that brings great pain, suffering, loss, destruction. There is no suggestion at all that the event is due to morally wrong doings. In On Free Will, Augustine is concerned with the agent sense, with doings that are morally wrong. This, we can call it evil one, will be my default sense here. When I shift to the second sense, I'll refer to evil two. St. Paul says, "Let us not do evil, that good may come." He is using evil in the evil one sense. Let us never do morally wrong actions in order to bring about some good. In the simplest trolley case, a runaway trolley is about to run over 5 persons standing on track A. If we choose to throw a switch, our action will divert the trolley to track B, where only 1 person will be run over. As Jim noted, moral theorists now use the word trolley case in a generalized sense to cover any such hard choice case, not just those where the threat is from trolleys. I'm thinking first we can use Augustine's distinction to give a general description. Trolley cases, definition. There is some imminent event, E1, threatening some person or persons with a great evil 2, event causing harm, suffering, pain. We can do some action A that will prevent the occurrence of this event, but our action will result in some other event, E2, that is an evil 2 for some other person or persons. How does the Pauline principle apply to trolley cases? My first thesis is that it does not apply in the following simple way. So here's something someone might say. The Pauline principle forbids us to redirect the trolley from track A, where there are 5 people on the track, to track B, where there's only 1 person. It does so because in forbidding us to do evil, it is forbidding us to do an evil to 1 person on track B so that good may come to others, the 5 on track A. This simplistic application seems wrong. It equivocates between the 2 senses of evil that Augustine distinguishes. The intrusion of the phrase "do an evil" alerts us to this. To do an evil to the person on track B is to cause an event that is evil in the second sense, an evil bringing loss of life to that person. The Pauline principle does not tell us to avoid actions that cause events that are evil in this second sense. It tells us to avoid doings that are evil 1, that are morally wrongdoings. This leads me to protest one aspect of Jim's stimulating background paper to speakers. Jim clearly has much respect for the Pauline principle. He notes, however, that it has been, quote, rejected as an absolute principle because, quote, there clearly are exceptions to it. To accept something as an absolute principle or to see it in an absolutist way is to see the principle as having no exceptions. And Jim then explains the exceptions as follows. Surely doing evil that good may come of it is justified when the resulting harm is, 1, trivial, as in the case of stepping on someone's foot to get out of a crowded subway, or 2, easily repairable, as in the case of lying to a temporarily depressed friend to keep her from committing suicide. After explaining a third class of exceptions, Jim continues, yet, despite the recognition that there are exceptions to the principle, and despite the disagreement over the extent of these exceptions, the Pauline principle still plays an important role in contemporary moral theory. Using Augustine, I here make my protest. Consider condition 1, the triviality condition. My wife Anne, let's say, steps on your foot to achieve the good of getting off a crowded subway, the Paris Metro, say. The action does cause an evil, but only in the evil to sense. The action causes an event, a sudden compression of the top of your boot that brings you pain. But the triviality condition obtains. It's a pretty trivial pain. Anne is a French woman, so she doesn't weigh much. And your boot is stout. And if Anne missed the stop, she'd miss a rendezvous with her eagerly awaiting lover. Same one. So let's grant the triviality condition is here met. Now, in granting this, are we also granting that we have here an exception to the Pauline principle? I'm thinking not. The Pauline principle says that we should not do evil, act in a morally wrong way, that good may come of it. To have an exception, we need a case where this sentence doesn't quite make sense. I'll read it and then correct it. Where what a morally wrong action is something we should do. Oh, I should have proofread this better. Well, what do we need? We need a case where an action is a morally wrong action, and yet it's okay to do because of some good that comes of it. But my wife stepping on your foot was not a morally wrong action. I don't say this just because she's my wife and she's rendezvousing with me. I say it because this is what the triviality condition means to be telling us. That if the evil to event is sufficiently trivial and the good brought about sufficiently serious, the action is not a morally wrong action. For that reason, we should not say that cases where the triviality condition applies are exceptions to the Pauline principle. They are not, for the same reason, cases showing that the Pauline principle fails to be absolute. Now here one might begin to wonder that in defending the Pauline principle as an absolute, I've made it an empty tautology. It's trivially impossible, one might think, for a morally wrong action to be okay to do. It's trivially necessary that it's not okay to do a morally wrong action even though good comes of it. So, there's two responses to this objection. One is the earnest freshman objection. And the earnest freshman objection says, when Paul says, let us never do morally wrong actions that good is will come of that, he's thinking morally wrong actions are those forbidden by the simple rules of plain morality. Don't lie, don't steal. And what he's saying is, if an action violates those rules, one of those rules, you should never do it, regardless of the good that comes from it. This I call the earnest freshman solution to the threat. A more mature Christian view, I think, will draw on Ross's moral theoretic distinction between prima facie and all things considered duties. It will see these standard moral rules as spelling out prima facie moral duties, or equivalently of identifying relevant wrong-making and right-making features of actions. If an action's a lie, that gives you some reason, good moral reason not to do it. In situations where these conflict, we must weigh all the relevant moral features to determine the all things duty. With this in mind, and remember I'm trying to defend here against the idea that I've made the Pauline principle a tautology, we can draw on an insight of Derek Parfit in his 2011 On What Matters, who in turn draws on a long line of moral theory, going back to Plato's answer to Glaucon and Adimantus. Parfit distinguishes various senses, all he thinks important of the locution, what we morally ought to do. One of these, Parfit says, is the morally decisive reason sense. In this sense, to ask what one ought morally to do is to ask what we, quote, what we have morally decisive reasons to do, where this means asking whether an action is one we have morally decisive reasons to do, which in turn is to ask, and here's the most important one, whether we have reasons to act in this way that morally outweigh any reasons that we may have to not act in this way. Now, part of Parfit's intent here is to put us in a position to ask whether one's net moral reasons for doing an action must always, by virtue perhaps of being moral reasons, outweigh any non-moral reasons we may have for not doing the action. This, Parfit's question and the Pauline principle can illuminate each other. It's plausible to see Paul as addressing, in part, a pagan culture, or our own increasingly pagan in ourselves, the gods petitioned by the Romans in Paul's day, or the inner idols we serve, may give no special weight to the net moral considerations made, as Bayer puts it, from a moral point of view, as distinct from other kinds of considerations, from the personal advancement point of view, the social etiquette point of view, the national security point of view, and so on. For both ancient and postmodern pagans, it may be deeply revelatory to hear that one true God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, cares overridingly about what is morally right, about justice, that he means us to care overridingly about these things too, and that net moral considerations must always trump net considerations from any or all of these other points of view. This avoids the earnest freshman's mistake of taking as an absolute each individual standard moral rule, but at a deeper level it finds something fundamentally right in the freshman intuition, and something entirely wrong in the ancient or postmodern pagan. For it affirms that moral reasons are absolute. The net moral reasons making an action what morally ought to be done are always decisive over net non-moral reasons for not doing the action, no matter what. So, my point is just, the Pauline principle is no longer trivial. It does say, let us never do a morally evil action that good may come of it. But what it's teaching us in part there is that the net moral considerations outweigh these other considerations. And if you didn't think that, you have something genuinely revelatory on your horizon. Part 2, can we rightly cause evil doings? Augustine, Calvin, and me. Evil, embracing Auguste's distinction, splits his question in two. He wants to know whether God authors either sort of evil. Augie also splits his answer. Yes, God does cause, sometimes, events that are evil too, events bringing pain, suffering, and loss. But no, God does not ever cause deeds that are evil, that are morally wrong actions. This no looks uncontroversially true. Its truth leads to the main question in Augustine's book. What then is the cause of these evil doings? Though the no seems uncontroversial, Augustine gives a brief argument for it. This is always a bad idea. Augustine's argument has a problem. And what it supports, the conclusion, if not controversial, is controverted. It's controverted and rejected by Calvin. I explore these things now in the hope it will cast an illuminating shadow on how the Pauline principle bears on the problem of evil. Augustine's argument goes like this. If you know or believe that God is good, and we may not think otherwise, then he cannot do evil. Again, if we confess that God is just, and to deny this is sacrilegious, then he gives rewards to the good just as he gives punishments to the wicked. But of course, the punishments are evil to those who suffer them. Evil in sense too. They bring pain and suffering. Hence, if no one is punished unjustly, and this we must believe, since we believe the universe is governed by divine providence, then God is not the author of the evil a man does, though he is the author of the evil a man suffers. The argument that God does not cause deeds that are evil is not easy to spot. It starts at the beginning of the passage, hibernates in the middle, and resumes near the end. It starts with this. If you know or believe that God is good, and we may not think otherwise, then he cannot do evil. So God, being good, cannot do evil. Since evil is predicated of doings, we have here the agent sense. God cannot do morally wrong actions. Well, Marilyn will disagree with this, but we'll wait to see how. The agent sense then goes out of play until the last line but one, where it pops back out. God is not the author of the evil a man does. But here we see a momentous step or slide, a slep, let's call it. The slep is from God does not himself do evil actions to God does not cause others to do evil actions. It's only by this slep that Augie addresses Evo's question, does God cause evil doings? Clearly there's a tacit premise here. If we fill it in mechanically to get a valid modus ponens argument, the premise is what I will call the no do, so no cause premise, or just no for short. No says, if God, the premise says, we'll call that no too, if God doesn't do evil deeds, then he doesn't cause others to do evil deeds either. So Augustine supposes, I surmise, that this premise is true. So obviously true, perhaps, that it doesn't need to be explicitly defended or even stated. Why might this be? What is the intuitive rationale for the bridge premise? What's its intuitive heart, its epistemic prime mover? One idea, which I think is right, is that it really expresses the following proposition. Call it no prime. If it's morally wrong for an agent X to do a deed, then it is morally wrong for any other agent to cause X to do this deed. Let me read that over to see if it's right. If it's morally wrong for an agent X, that would be, say, the Pharaoh, to do some deed, then it's morally wrong for any other agent, say God, to cause the Pharaoh to do this deed. Yeah, that's just right. That's the key idea. If it's morally wrong for you to do a deed, it's morally wrong for me to cause you to do that deed. Noting Augie's stress on God's goodness in this passage, an even better way to put it might be this. If the goodness of any being precludes it from doing any morally wrong deed, then the goodness of that being also precludes it from causing another person to do a morally wrong deed. Here my agents have shifted. Let me read that again, using you and me as an example. If the goodness of me precludes me from doing any morally wrong deed, then my goodness also precludes me, stops me from causing you to do any morally wrong deed. I'll call this the general preclusion thesis. It's general and it applies to any morally good being. God, good angels like Gabriel, perhaps even to good humans, insofar as they are good. Augie's argument doesn't need so general a premise, he needs only a special preclusion thesis about God, which would go this way. If the goodness of God precludes God from doing any morally wrong deed, then it also precludes God from causing any other agent, you or me, to do morally wrong deeds. Can the special version grip us apart from the general version? Maybe not. It seems like the general version is what kind of gives the special version its bite. At any rate, what Calvin disputes? Why God does cause evil doings. Calvin, I believe, rejects the special preclusion thesis. He does so in working out a strong view he finds in Scripture of God's sovereignty. Remember how Joseph's brothers stole from Joseph his amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, threw him in a pit to die, and then, relenting slightly, sold him to passing gypsies as a slave. We softies that we are may want to say that God didn't cause Joseph's brothers to do these wicked things. God merely allowed this. But Calvin, biblically bad to the bone, thinks the allowing-causing distinction that applies to us doesn't apply to God. In teaching God's sovereignty, he thinks, Scripture teaches God's efficacious causation of all events, including of the brothers' doings. Does this mean Calvin thinks the brothers' doings were not caused by themselves? Not necessarily. Calvin may here hold a concurrentist view of divine causation. On this view, full divine causation of an event is compatible with full creaturely causation of an event. So I can be the cause of my event, the full cause. God can also be the full cause of it. So that he caused it doesn't mean I didn't. Scripture has Joseph say to his brothers, "You meant it to me for evil, but God meant it to me for good." Scripture is, Calvin thinks, teaching that God willed and caused Joseph's brothers to do what they did to him. Yet Calvin wants to say it was still their doing. And if he is a concurrentist, he can say that each of them was the cause of his doings. Still, I read Calvin as denying the special preclusion thesis. God does not and cannot do morally wrong actions, but God can and does, in the hidden counsels of his sovereign governance, cause human agents, like Joseph's brothers, to do morally wrong actions. Why I'm not a good Calvinist. Taken straight up, that is, applying it as Calvin does without dilution to all morally wicked actions, I here find Calvin just too hardcore. I want a softer model of divine sovereignty, allowing some distinction between God's allowing things and God's causing things. I want to avoid God's intimate participation in horrendous evils so obscene as to give me theological nausea. His pill is just too bitter. While I can't swallow Calvin's bitter pill, I have sucked on it long enough to absorb a sugar coating he gives it. Joseph meeting his brothers again after becoming the second most powerful man in Egypt. He meets them again after this. After a dramatic reconciliation, he forgives his brothers, saying of them what I said before, "You meant it to me for evil, but God meant it to me for good." Calvin sees this as also helping us understand how God can cause evil actions without being evil himself. God, while causing the brothers to do what they did, had a different intention than they had in doing their actions. The brothers, jealous and hateful of Joseph, intended nothing but to get rid of him. God, in causing them to act wickedly, intended nothing but good for Joseph, for his family, and for many, many others. I find something sweet in this point, though not sweet enough to swallow the pill. Jihad trolley. Perhaps the Augustine-Calvin disagreement over God's relation to evil can here enrich current moral theorizing. I here see a new trolley case to map the limits of the Pauline principle. Standard exceptions, as Jim puts them to the principle, include cases where it's okay for one to act in ways that cause evil to, that one foresees causing evil to, events causing pain, suffering, and loss. Calvin, unlike Augustine, thinks a good God, due to good intentions, can also cause evil one, can cause Joseph's brothers to do morally wrong actions. Are there cases where we, due to our good intentions, can rightly cause others to do morally wrong actions? Consider Jihad trolley. You, an experienced clinical psychologist, are in the first car of a high-speed trolley hijacked by 3 terrorists. The terrorists, 2 men and a woman, have machine pistols. They guard the cab where a 4th terrorist is running the train. The trolley is now moving toward Washington, and by cell phone you learn that 2 similar hijackings have wrought great destruction in New York. You speak the same language as the 3, and from the front seat you've had 2 hours to observe closely their interactions. It has become obvious to you that the woman is married to one of the men and that he has a pathologically possessive attitude toward her. You also realize she and the other man have a special bond and affection, perhaps innocent, perhaps not. You suddenly see a plan. With a few remarks, you lead the husband to believe his wife has been disloyal, committing adultery with the other man. The man looks at his wife, and the other man, as you anticipated, erupts into a murderous rage. He loses control and fires on both, killing them. He stands stunned at what he has done and then turns the weapon on himself, committing suicide. In this scenario, let's grant the husband's actions, murdering others and self-murder, are clearly morally wrong actions. By your actions, you caused the husband to do these things. And you did this intentionally, fully desiring just these or very similar actions. Were your actions thereby morally wrong? While your actions caused the husband's actions, they were, of course, not the complete cause of them. But for human agents, our actions are never the complete cause of other events. Striking a match causes the match to light, but this is only by virtue of background conditions like the volatile phosphorus composition of the match, the presence of oxygen, the absence of moisture, and so on. It remains true that your striking the match causes it to light. Just as truly, by your remarks, you caused intentionally the volatile husband to ignite, flaming out of control. Again, were your actions wrong? I find in myself little inclination to say so, and this because of Calvin's sweet point. The husband's action was done with one dominant intention, fueled by his murderous rage. Your actions in causing him to erupt were informed by an entirely different set of dominant intentions. This, as Calvin says, surely makes a difference. The Jihad trolley case, I'm thinking, thus shows the falsity of Augustine's general preclusion thesis, the thesis that if your goodness prevents you from doing morally wrong actions, whether you're God or you, it also prevents you from causing others to do morally wrong actions. So it illustrates how trolley cases and the Pauline trolley line are relevant to the problem of evil. So I'm now a member of Jim's PTL club. Last part of the paper, the threat of moral skepticism. Skeptical theists this section was written by my brother Artsky. I don't know, I don't think I should really let him in the room to read it. I think I'll just read it for him. He's dangerous. Skeptical theists like Steve and Mike, affirm two things. As theists, they affirm that each horrific evil connects to some fabulous good, a good that, as God sees, is so fabulous as to outweigh the evil and justify God's allowing it. Our failure to see these goods, they at least admit, poses agonizing existential questions. But as skeptical theists, they think this failure poses no evidential problem. Their reason is embarrassingly simple. If God does exist, they say, then God being God and all, our failure to see what God sees is just what we should expect. The end of skeptical theism has been a slow train coming. Lots of us have been arguing that if you're a skeptical theist, you'll end up in a paralyzing moral skepticism too. Bergman's defense, Mike Bergman, tries to show this isn't so. 2 years ago, my last time at Notre Dame, I showed at length why it fails. I am kind of turning into him, aren't I? This time I will be more brief. Bergman tries to explain why skeptical theism seems to threaten moral skepticism. He does a pretty good job, but not good enough. He stops short of showing the full nature of the threat. Bergman is himself a skeptical theist. He says we can divide skeptical theism, like a brain, into two parts. First, there's T, the theistic part, the theistic lobe, let's say. Second, there's S, the skeptical part, the skeptical lobe. The theistic lobe of skeptical theism is simply the affirmation that T, there is a God in the traditional theistic sense. The skeptical lobe, put somewhat crudely, asserts this. We have no good reason for thinking that the following proposition is true. I'm going to call it rep. We have no good reason for thinking rep. The possible goods and possible evils and their connections to present events that we know of are representative of the possible goods and evils and connections to present events that there are. That is, we see bad things happening, we see some goods that might be connected to them, some evils that might be connected to them. We wonder, are those things we see representative of all the goods there are? If the evil we see outweighs the goods, is that some evidence that all the evils there are that connect with this event outweigh all the goods there are? No. We have no reason to think that. That's what the skeptical lobe of skeptical theism says. Now, what does Bergman mean, we have no good reason for thinking that rep is true? He means something pretty radical. He's not entirely upfront about this, so we have to watch his phrasing closely. Sometimes he puts the idea by slipping into the no idea how likely phrasing. He says things like this: we have no idea how likely it is that rep is true, that the goods, evils, and connections we know of are representative of the ones there are. Other times he slips even deeper into a for all we know, then again phrasing. I really like this one. For all we know, it might be likely that the goods and evils we see in relation to this particular act are representative of all the goods and evils that bear on the act. Then again, for all we know, this might be highly unlikely. In other words, the skeptical lobe of Bergman's skeptical theist brain isn't just a little uncertain about whether rep is true. It is in the complete dark about rep. It has no idea whether rep is very probable or very improbable. Keep this in mind. Okay, so why on Bergman's story does skeptical theism just seem, to threaten moral skepticism? It's because, Bergman says, it seems to conflict with part of common sense morality, or what, to save a few syllables, I'll call plain ethics. Plain ethics judges some actions, murder, rape, and the like, are wrong in themselves. They're intrinsically wrong. Perhaps plain ethics here relies on deontic principles that are hardwired into our ordinary human conscience. But for a wide class of other actions, plain ethics judges them morally wrong, or permissible, or obligatory, but not because they're intrinsically wrong. So far as deontic principles go, like don't kill, don't steal, don't so forth, their moral status is indeterminate or neutral. I'll call such acts neuter acts. For neuter acts, plain ethics says to judge moral rightness or wrongness by looking at the consequences of the actions. It's here on Bergman's story that skeptical theism seems to conflict with plain ethics. To explain this, Bergman introduces Sally. Let's call her Nurse Sally, because I'll introduce my own Sally, Hiker Sally, later. Bergman's Sally embraces the skeptical lobe, but she's not a theist. Bergman makes her an agnostic. This is because he thinks that if skeptical theism conflicts with plain ethics, the conflict must arise only from the skeptical lobe. So Nurse Sally is considering some action that is in the neutral group. Say she's a school nurse. 10-year-old Tommy has an owie, and she's deciding whether to offer him an ibuprofen tablet. This is a neuter act. Offering him a tablet isn't like murder or stealing or lying. One consequence of offering him this, if he takes it, would be to reduce his pain. So normally, this is a no-brainer. It's okay for her to offer it to him. But Nurse Sally remembers that Tommy's mother told her that one of her 6 children has a phobia of tablets and can go into a panic attack at the mere mention of them. Taking this into account and weighing the potential benefits and harms, Nurse Sally judges that it would be morally wrong to offer the tablet to Tommy. And Bergman tells us that Sally's main reason, so this is a plain ethics judgment. Bergman believes that it's also a case of moral knowing, that this type of judgment, she can be confident enough and know that she is discerning the morally right thing to do. And this is on the basis of the following reason. It's a twofold reason, and it's very important to listen to both parts of it. So listen to the second part especially. Nurse Sally's main reason for thinking that the act would be wrong is that, A1, she can see that the immediate result of the action would be an enormous harm to the child, or might be. That would be like the panic attack. And A2, she has no reason for thinking any comparably significant good would come of it. The relief of pain of the owie doesn't compare with the danger. So that's how Sally makes her judgment. That's the way we make moral judgments for a large class of actions, these neuter actions. Now, that's plain ethics. Why does skeptical theism seem to conflict with plain ethics? Here's how Bergman explains the apparent conflict. Suppose Sally, reflecting on her skeptical lobe, realizes that although she sees one small benefit and one potential big harm that could result from the act of offering the tablet, she realizes her skeptical lobe commits her to saying the following: that she has no idea how likely it is that the consequences of the act of offering the tablet would, in the long run, be for the best. For all she knows, it might be highly likely that the long run consequences of the act would be much better than the long run consequences of her refraining from the act of offering the tablet. Then again, for all she knows, this might be highly unlikely. She really has no idea what the remote consequences would be. Bergman does this part well. Sally's skeptical lobe really does entail this. But now listen to how Bergman describes why this seems to conflict with plain ethics. Here is how he excavates the apparent conflict. I'm quoting him, but with just a few bells and whistles to make it clearer. Here's the conflict. As a matter of plain ethics, common sense morality, Sally, on one hand, thinks she knows it's wrong to perform the act because of its harmful consequences, the risk of inciting the panic attack. And yet, on the other hand, she accepts from her skeptical lobe, she thinks she has no idea whether or not its ultimate consequences are likely to be for the best overall. Here I don't think Bergman did so well. Why? He's trying to express an alleged tension between these two things, what her plain ethics tells her and what her skeptical lobe tells her. But in expressing these, Bergman gives a truncated version of both. He hasn't made full use of things he himself has told us about each of them. Let's expand to include the things he told us and expose the real tension. For this hand, we need to include both folds of that twofold reason I mentioned. For this hand, we need to include that more radical phrasing of the skeptical lobe that he slips into. When we do this, we get the following. And here I'm going to express it for a case where a person judges an action as morally right. Sally judges the action is morally right and sees this as a case of moral knowing. The main reason for this is, here's the plain ethics, she can see the likelihood of one result of the action that would be of significant benefit to the child, and she has, in the second part of the moral reason, she has no reason for thinking the action would lead to any comparable significant harm for the child. And yet, because of her skeptical lobe, she also accepts that she has no idea whether the action is likely or unlikely to lead to any comparably significant harm for the child. For all she knows, it's very probable that it will have harmful consequences that would far outweigh the expected good consequences. We can now see where the conflict really lies. It lies in the tension between A2, the second fold in her twofold main plain ethics reason, and her skeptical lobe. Consider first A2. Why, for plain ethics Sally, is A2 half of her main reason for judging and allegedly knowing that the act is the morally right thing to do? It is, I submit, because she takes it as evidentially relevant. Her seeing no harm coming from the action is important because it lowers the likelihood of there being some such harm. If it had no such evidential bearing, why is it half of her main reason, enabling her judgment to be a case of moral knowing? And I think it is. I think that is an important part of plain ethics reasoning. But from the expanded part of B, we see that Sally's skeptical lobe rules out any such evidential relevance. She's in complete probabilistic darkness whether her action will result in significant harm. So seeing no such harm has not probabilistically helped her. Her skeptical lobe B is kicking Artsky said kicking the shit out of, I wouldn't say that, the half of her main reason for the plain ethics judgment. We can see the conflict more starkly by an analogous case of judging that some action is right in a non-moral sense, say culinarily right. You are the imperial palace chef cooking for the emperor. One of your sauces is a bit thick. You have no special spring water to add to it, and you are thinking of adding some flat water to it. Is this, you ask, the culinarily right thing to do in the situation? As a plain cuisine chef, you feel you can confidently judge, indeed know, that it is the right thing to do. Your main twofold reason being that, A1, you see that adding the flat water will nicely thin the sauce, and A2, you have no reason for thinking the flattened water will significantly harm the dish. On the other hand, you are a devout skeptical Buddhist, and on that basis hold, you have no idea whether adding the flat water is likely to hurt it. For all you know, it is very probable that it will ruin the dish. For all you know, it's very improbable it will ruin it. If you're really skeptical in that sense, then what good has it done you to have as a second part of your main reason that you don't see any reason to think it will harm the dish? Here we see clearly that plain ethics, plain cuisine thinking is on a collision course with the skeptical lobe. This paper is going to be too long. What does one do in a case like that?
Continue.
So, what do you do?
Continue.
So, how does Bergman argue there is no real conflict? I've argued so far he does not really excavate the conflict very well. He hasn't shown the real nature of the conflict, but you now see it. So how does he argue there's no real conflict? His strategy is to give a defense. A defense working roughly the way defenses work against logical or probabilistic arguments from evil. To show there are no real logical or probabilistic conflicts between proposition A or proposition and proposition B, one produces a third proposition such that A and B fully cohere with the two, and such that the third has an appropriate logical or probabilistic status. Bergman does something similar. He produces an ethical principle that he thinks coheres well both with plain ethics and with skeptical theism, and that is a plausible enough principle to show the two are coherent. Principle M, for any action A that is not intrinsically wrong, we morally ought to decide whether to do A by considering the consequences we can reasonably expect of performing A and its alternatives. We should refrain from doing A if the reasonably expected consequences seem significantly worse than those of any live alternative. We should perform A if the reasonably expected consequences of A seem significantly better than of every live alternative. The most important feature of his defense is that it makes the rightness or wrongness of neuter actions depend solely on the consequences one can reasonably expect from the action. If plain ethics can embrace this, then it is of no matter for moral knowing whether the action also impinges on fabulous goods and horrific bads that God sees and takes into account in his actions, which we have no access to. If we can't form reasonable expectations about them, they are irrelevant to our decision about what we ought to do. Why Bergman's defense fails. Hiker Sally. Consider then Hiker Sally. She's a common sense atheist. Her brain has no skeptical lobe. She is practical, not philosophical. It also has no theistic lobe. She's never thought about God at all. She's an ex-ranger, skilled in battlefield warfare and a superb athlete. This is her story. I was hiking a remote trail in the Alaskan Yukon. Coming around a bend, I saw a man crouching over a child. Oh, she left out one sentence. She's hiking and she's walking for a while along a railroad track. Coming around a bend in the track, I saw a man crouching over a child. He didn't see me. It wasn't hard to slip into the woods and creep up on them. The man was armed and clearly crazy. He'd manacled a small boy, maybe 6 years old, to the tracks. 2 hands to one rail, 2 feet to the other. The boy was unconscious. As I came up behind me, he heard me, went for his gun, got a shot off. He missed. My ranger knife didn't. I took him out. The boy was breathing deeply, maybe drugged, but his vitals were good. But those manacles, they were hardened steel. No way to get them off without serious bolt cutters or a torch rig. I turned the guy's clothes inside out for the keys. None. We were way off the cell phone grid. I saw only 3 choices. First, I could build a shelter for the boy and stay with him, hoping against hope for help and no train. Second, I could build a shelter for him, as bear-proof as possible, and begin the long run back to a homesteader I'd chanced on. The guy had a radio and we could call a helicopter in. All told, that would take at least 12 hours, maybe 18. Those were the common sense options. There was one other option. I'm a battlefield medic. I know how to amputate, done lots of it. I could free the boy, 2 hands, 2 feet, and carry him out. Here's the thing, if a train came, there was no way to stop it on time, and I had no idea at all of the schedule. Once a month, once a week, once a day, no idea at all. I know railways, and you can't tell. Rails don't rust. A yearly pesticide keeps the weeds out. For hiker Sally, then, the likelihoods of certain key contingencies are shrouded in radical darkness. What will be, that's the train schedule, what will be the result on Sally's ability to make a common sense judgment about what the right thing to do is, and on her confidence in that judgment? Well, I think we can well imagine Sally saying something like this. Oh, she did say this in an email to me. Legally speaking, I knew the law might crucify me if I freed the boy by amputating 4 hands and feet and carried him out. Part of me thought it was the morally right thing to do. But really, I just couldn't tell what the right thing to do was. Not without having some idea about that train schedule. I don't believe in God, but I spent 2 hours praying, lots of it asking for light on what I ought to do. No answer. I tried to remember Sturba's ethics class. No light. I could just remember that Camus thing. The morally right thing to do here, without info about the train, one just couldn't tell. I was sweating blood then because I realized I just had to decide. I just had to make a damn choice. Hiker Sally's prayer is an expression of her agony. And I think you'll agree she's right, cognitive and emotionally. Cognitively, she's right that she can't tell. She doesn't know what the right thing to do is. Emotionally, she's right in being driven to a place where plain ethics thinking breaks down, a place of agonized existential decision. But if principle M is right, then that's wrong. Hiker Sally's agony is ill-founded. She can't form any reasonable expectation about the train schedule, so by principle M, the train schedule has no bearing at all on what she ought to do. It's no different than if the boy were trapped under an immovable rock. She should just pretend the train tracks are rock, forget that they're train tracks. But that's absurd. What's most clear here is that Sally's desperate ignorance of certain key train likelihoods should leave her, just like she says, in an agonized state of not knowing what the right thing to do is. Now, Sally's agony and moral uncertainty reflects her ignorance, a local ignorance about rep. There are some benefits, harms, and connections she can form reasonable expectations about. She can build a shelter that will probably keep the bears out. She can amputate with very expectable harms and very expectable benefits. But what about the train? And it all depends on that. About that, nothing is expectable and nothing unexpectable. So she can have no idea whether the expectable goods and bads are representative of the unknown goods or bads depending on that train schedule. And this, most of you want to agree with me, Artsky, shatters her plain ethics ability to judge what the right thing to do is. This means that Bergman's defense must be stood on its head. If principle M entails that hiker Sally shouldn't agonize on account of not knowing the right thing to do, because she can know it, then it is principle M that must go. Hiker Sally's agony helps us see how our confidence in moral judgments does reflect our confidence in the presumption of representativeness, that the good and bad consequences of an action whose likelihoods we can access are fairly representative of the good and bad consequences there are. The skeptical lobe of skeptical theism conflicts with plain ethics because it reneges on rep. Put in standard format, we can put the hiker Sally argument, or for short, hike, as follows. Hike 1. If this presumption of rep is not a condition of common sense, plain ethics, moral knowing, and judgment, then a person in hiker Sally's situation will not be, and appropriately be, in her agonized state of not knowing what the right thing to do is. Hike 2, but a person in Sally's situation is, and appropriately is, in this agonized state of ignorance. So, modus tollens, the rep presumption is a condition of common sense, moral knowing, and judgment. Now, hiker Sally didn't have a skeptical lobe. For her, a very abnormal situation forced her to a temporary or local suspension of belief in rep. This drove her to local moral skepticism, an inability to judge what, in that situation, the morally right thing to do is. But for skeptical theists like Bergman or Ray or Wykstra, Sally's abnormal situation is their characteristic situation. The same moral skepticism must erode a huge class of their judgments about which plain ethical thinking is, naively, quite confident. For any skeptical theist, a large class of our actions are made on hidden railroad tracks on which run hidden railway cars carrying hidden axiological freight on schedules that are visible to God but inscrutable to us. The skeptical lobe must thus drive consistent logical skeptical theists to a global suspension of rep and to a global moral skepticism about the entire class of neuter moral judgments. There's more I have to say, but my twin brother Steve, as usual, wants me to shut up so he can have the last word. I'm close, real close. Look, a page and a quarter left. Okay, so far I've described an impasse between Bergman's defense and Artsky's attack. I'll call this the impasse. Does current moral theory offer resources for moving beyond the impasse? Bergman's defense relies on principle M. To embrace principle M is to be what we might call restricted utilitarianism. Utilitarian. It is to hold that there is a restricted but large class of actions, the moral status, the neuter actions, the moral status of which, their moral rightness or wrongness, is determined by utilitarian factors. Real utilitarians, as I will call them, hold the moral status of all actions is so determined. We might hope, therefore, that real utilitarians and their critics would have relevant insights to offer us. In preparing this paper, I made a first foray into this. I've learned that moral theorizing over recent decades has revived respect for John Stuart Mill and given rise to a flourishing industry of utilitarian moral theory. In my first foray into it, I'm already discovering much that is relevant. The first thing I've learned is that the impasse between Bergman and Artsky seems to mirror an important in-house debate among real utilitarians. The debate is over this: does the moral rightness of an action depend on objective utility or subjective utility? That is, does an action's moral status depend on the action's actual consequences and their net utility, or does it depend on what expectable consequences and their utility will be? That is, on what the agent believes or rationally should believe about the action's consequences and utility. The impasse, I'm suggesting, mirrors this debate. Consider Bergman's side. And using principle M, Bergman is evoking a subjective utilitarian understanding of what the right thing to do is. And seeing the motivation for subjective utility will help us see why his principle has appeal. As I understand it, one motivation for the subjective conception is this: when we diagnose someone's acts as the morally wrong thing to do, we want this to guide our responses to past actions, our responses, that is, in the way of blaming, chastising, punishing, regretting, and the like. The subjective utilitarian sees that if a person had no way of knowing or predicting some actual disastrous consequence of their action, then the actuality of that consequence is irrelevant to whether we blame or chastise the person. What should guide our blame-type responses are consequences the person could reasonably have foreseen or expected. This illuminates why principle M works for Bergman as it does. His own skeptical theism is telling him that many of his actions impinge on God-seen goods that he has no comprehension of. How could he then ever, for the class of neuter choices, ever know what the right thing to do is? The answer: make the choices depend on the expectable consequences of the action. Similarly, for Artsky, Artsky's relying on an objective criterion of the morally right thing to do. It depends on the actual consequences. This, too, has a rationale. What objectivists stress is that when we are in decision situations trying to determine what the morally right thing to do is, our intent is to figure out the actual consequences of our action and their net harm. We are not just trying to figure out what we can figure out about them. That helps explain why the hiker Sally story grips us. She's in a decision-making situation, trying to figure out the next right thing to do. There is some next right thing to do, some best thing to be done for the child. She's trying to figure it out. If she had more evidence about the train schedule, it would help. Artsky's story works so well because it evokes the criterion of the objectivist utilitarian. The hiker Sally critique, I was wrong. I wasn't near the end, but I am now. The hiker Sally critique, does it really mark the end of skeptical theism? My own skeptical theism as of late is in something of a crisis. One source is Artsky's challenge. Skeptical theism is, I think, right in asking the atheist to agree to this conditional. If God exists, then the events around us are connected to more goods in heaven and earth than is dreamt of in your philosophy, quoting a little Shakespeare. But my own skeptical theism has gone farther out on a limb. For in discussing the goods that guide God's providential governing of the events we see, I tended, in my rash youthful days, to say things like this: the relation of God's vision to ours may roughly be like the relation between the goods seen by a parent and her 1-month-old infant. This, I now think, made skeptical theism too skeptical. The Apostle Paul, stressing the contrast between the Christian's current impoverished epistemic state and the richer state awaiting us in glory, says, "Now we see through a glass darkly, then we shall see face to face." This does not, I think, make us like a 1-month-old infant. One who sees through a glass darkly can still see something. And the importance of what we see seems stressed by Jesus when he says, "No longer do I call you servants, for the servant does not know what his master is doing. But I have called you friends, for all that I have heard from my Father I have made known to you." In addressing the new challenges posed by Artsky and others, I am seeing the need to begin a more serious mapping of boundaries between sorts of divine goods we may rightly expect to be beyond our ken and those goods that we can, albeit through a glass darkly, even now increasingly hope to discern. This is a big change, and perhaps it merits a name change. In the place of skeptical theism, I propose the name diffident theism. And thanks to Jim's invitation, I think I am glimpsing how diffidence without skepticism may help get us beyond the impasse. There are, I think, two hard questions Artsky is putting to a Bergman-style defense. One is an explanation question. If plain ethics does not assume a representativeness thesis, how then do we explain hiker Sally's moral agony, her sense that she just can't tell what the right thing to do is? The other is a rationale question. If the actual goods or harms resulting from an action bear no relation we know of to that small sample of goods and harms we have cognitive access to, then what's the point of, the rationale for trying to figure out what is indicated by that small sample? Why, in a morally serious way, even bother? My first foray into moral theory has helped me see these as key questions. I think I may also be glimpsing a Christian theistic answer to them. To the rationale question, the answer goes like this. What God wants is for us to be increasingly renewed in and conformed to the divine image. Through God's general revelation and his redemptive revelation, his zooming in work with the people of Israel and his zooming out work through the person and work of Christ, we have important access to sorts of goods that jointly both God cares passionately about and God passionately wants us to also care about. These are not all of his goods, not even all of his sorts of goods. They are a small sample. Skeptical theism is right that we have no idea what proportion of his axiological space that sample occupies. So to be renewed in the divine image is not to become godlike masters of the art of maximizing actual total good. That's God's job. Our job, I am thinking, is to let our moral decision-making increasingly care about that special subclass, the sorts of goods both God cares about and wants us to care about. Even here we will miscalculate the consequences, but in caring about them, we increasingly become like him in the creaturely sense of like that is the only sense that matters. That, I'm thinking, is the rationale for following an M-like principle. The same idea suggests a rival to Artsky's explanation of hiker Sally's agony. It wasn't because she couldn't see the total likely consequences, for good or ill, of the options she faced. No one ever sees that. It was because her heart was in the right place. She cared about the right sorts of goods, and she couldn't see, even over the next 24 hours, the likely consequences of her options on those goods, the life of that small child. On this way of thinking, the rationale for our plain ethics thinking and the explanation for our moral agony is the same. Insofar as by common or special grace we bear God's image, following an M-like principle for neuter actions is part of our redemption and our liberation. By this, in part, we order our lives to increasingly care about things God passionately cares about and has designed us to passionately care about. By this, we become a people closer to God's sacred heart, joining in that redemptive dance in which God calls us as friends to participate.
call on people. Steve will answer the question. Oh yeah, there's Jim's response. And then we'll do questions.
Thanks so much, Steve. Steve seeks to achieve two goals. First, to properly interpret the Pauline principle, particularly as it applies to God. And second, to improve upon Bergman's defense of skeptical theism. To properly interpret the Pauline principle, Steve distinguishes between causing evil and doing evil, allowing that God could be implicated in the former, but not the latter, which is immoral. But does Steve think that intentionally causing or allowing evil can never, all by itself, be immoral? Suppose I decided not to deflect a deadly missile that one of you inexplicably let fly hitting Steve's head when I could easily have done so. Suppose I don't do that. Surely it would seem that my intentionally causing or permitting such bad consequences, absent some further explanation, would have been morally wrong and morally evil. If that's right, then we are still faced with the question of when, if ever, directly permitting or causing horrendous evil is something God could not do in virtue of the Pauline principle. With respect to skeptical theism, I think Steve has definitely improved upon Bergman's defense. But I've also just come to think that both Steve and Bergman may be barking up the wrong tree, so to speak. Both of them set aside actions that are presumptively intrinsically wrong or evil, and focus on a class of actions like taking a medicine that may or may not be right or wrong, depending on the consequences. But I now think that what are presumptively intrinsically wrong or evil actions are centrally at issue with respect to the problem of evil. To see this, consider an act of murder, which is presumptively intrinsically wrong or evil, irrespective of its further consequences. Now consider the act of failing to prevent an actual murder. One could easily do so. Isn't that act too presumptively intrinsically wrong or evil, irrespective of its further consequences? If it is, then acts of this sort do raise a central problem for the problem of evil that skeptical theists of all stripes have yet to address. Thank you.
And now we'll take questions. Evan.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting and helpful paper. And I'm actually in significant sympathy with it. But as I understood it, the paper focuses on one target of the criticisms of skeptical theism, namely that it makes our judgments about what we ought to do in some way impotent, right? But there's another worry, and it has to do with the judgments we make about what God will do, worrisome. So, if you want to remain skeptical about the axiological structure of the world as God sees it, then shouldn't you worry about whether maybe God has reasons that we can't understand for betraying us tomorrow? So that in fact, he is not someone we can trust.
I wonder if like a 4-year-old child who has enough, like 1 month infants, they're not far enough along, but could a 4-year-old child be in a position where she would recognize that her mom and dad do we have to make her early, a little older, so she has enough to kind of be in a zone where she can have reasonable beliefs. I don't know if we do that for 4. So let's say 7 years old. But still, her mom and dad have many purposes for her that guide their dealings with her that she can't see. Could she be in a position where she understands 10% of their purposes? They're loving toward her. There's some sort of relational connection that allows her to trust in that love, and yet she doesn't see their full purposes. It doesn't seem to me that she'd be in a state where the reasonable thing for her to do would be say, well, you know, maybe they're just doing all these things like to fat me up because they really want to like have me for dinner when I'm 15 or something, you know? And that, logically, I don't see how she could, if she grants, she only sees a parcel of their purposes and really doesn't, I guess she has to believe what she sees is in some sense representative and with respect to the love the parents have for her, but she might not know much about, you know, the wedding dowry they're putting away or the educational fund or things like that. I don't know. That's sort of where my brain goes on the analogy. I sort of want to work from an analogy like that. Doesn't work for you?
No, I think you're caught in a dilemma. The more reasonable you make her grounds for trusting them, the more you have to worry about the grounds that the atheist raises for not trusting God as being indicative of God's nature. And the less you do, the more you have to worry about whether you have any reason to trust God.
I don't see that, but it's late. Does anybody else want to join in on that particular issue? Back to you.
Back to the queue. Sam. I've got Sam, then Jack, then Dustin, then back there, and then Bruce.
It is late. So I really like the diffident, I don't know about the particular version, but just the general diffident conclusion at the end. I think that is the right way, although I'm not sure how novel that is. That sounds like what I would have thought most theists think, namely that there's a range of goods with which we're intimately acquainted, and those are the ones we ought to pursue. And then of course, quoting the Romans passage, there's stuff beyond our ken. So I think something in that ballpark is exactly right. If the skeptical theist goes too far, your former self goes too far. I wanted to ask a question that's purely clarificatory because I think I missed something, but frankly, there's so many moving pieces I might not even be able to ask the question accurately, but let me just try it. So your response to the Bergman-Artsky debate at the end. So I feel like I'm asking a question of like Kierkegaard here, where there's like layers. Right, so your response was something of the form, this debate over M and its repercussions for rep mirrors this debate in utilitarian camps between the subjectivists and the objectivists. All right, am I right so far? Okay. And then you said that the Bergman side of this divide is sort of like the subjectivist side. And you purported the subjectivist side to be saying something slightly different than I would have thought they would have said. And then if you put what I thought they should have said, and then I'm lost as to how your response actually works anymore. So what I think you took the subjectivist to say about utility was something like, what we need to take into account, or all we need to take into account, lots of clarifications at quarter clauses there. What we need to take into account is something like what we in fact expect the utility of the consequences to be. Whereas it seemed like what the subjectivists really should say is what it's reasonable for someone to take the consequences, not what they in fact, and God don't knows what they in fact take. It could be all sorts of reasons they don't in fact take what's reasonable to take. And if we put the reasonableness clause back in, and we apply that to him, then I'm back with good old Artsky again, and thinking that even on that criteria, the hiker case seems decisive. And even on that sense of subjective utility, there's a kind of explosion problem here.
Okay, so on the first point, in characterizing the subjective utilitarian, I put it both ways, and the second one is the advised one, that rightness or wrongness of an action depends upon the expected, or I said more exactly, the reasonably expected, the things the person could have rationally expected. And I was putting that in the context of kind of retrospectively evaluating whether to blame someone, because I think that's one of the places the subjective account has a kind of natural home. So I'm with you there. I think that for Bergman, whether an action is right or wrong doesn't depend on what the actual consequences are and their value. It depends upon the reasonably expectable consequences, the ones using the means open to us that we can anticipate using our rational powers. So we're good there. But what I don't see is where you're thinking that, and then I wanted to say, I think that is how, when we're evaluating neutral actions, we should do it that way. We should be subjective utilitarians. What makes it, that's how God wants us to act on those, to look at the goods we ought to care about and see of those goods, how can we act in a way that maximizes the ones we can figure out best. And then the question is, well, so, and there I don't want to just repeat what I said. I want to hear, okay, so what's your problem with that? You think that puts us back in Artsky's sights in some way?
Because I would have thought that for Bergman, one of the things I know and hence should take into account when I calculate reasonable expected utility is skeptical theses 1 through 3. And once I put those back into play, as a skeptical theist presumably should, as Bergman should, then I go back to ignorance about what the reasonable expected utility is.
Not the reasonable, expectable utility. I mean, it's. Artsky's attack relies on the fact that there are goods you can see that are, there are goods you can see your actions will affect, and you're able to make some reasonable probabilistic judgments about those usually, except in horrible situations where you know there's some goods that are going to be affected, but you don't, like the train, but you don't know. But that's abnormal. So, and Bergman wants to say those ones you can reasonably anticipate and figure out and weigh the value of, those are the ones that really matter when you're trying to determine what you ought to do. That's what Bergman thinks. Artsky's challenge is, well, A, if you don't think those have any bearing on the actual good maximization, why worry about them? And so I think I have an answer to that, a theistic answer to that. And it's because by caring, if we do that and the goods are the ones God cares about, then caring about those passionately makes us more like God. And there's all kinds of other sorts of goods and even connections of those goods that we can't see. Goods we can see, we miss connections. But that doesn't affect, if we're caring about those goods, how we're still becoming his friends and fellow kingdom workers. Yeah. And when we are in moral agony, it's usually not because we don't have a God's eye picture of all the goods, how in actions, I mean, think of a nurse, she's in Germany in 1902, and there's a little baby named Adolf in her hands. You know, she doesn't know the effect of dropping little Adolf on his head. Might have been for the better from a God's eye point of view. If we were there, we'd say, drop him, drop him. But she's caring about the right things. She's caring for that little person. And we often don't even do that. I mean, the goods we care about are often so distant from a Christian point of view from the ones God means us to be caring about. It's enough just to learn to care more about the goods he wants us to care about, not to try to be like him and run the whole universe according to total good maximization.
Amen to that part, yeah.
Okay.
Jack.
So I had a really minor point. I don't think it affects your main argument, but I was a little curious about the way you characterized evils under evil type 2 as events that bring about pain, suffering, loss, destruction. I would have thought it would be events in which there is pain, loss, suffering, destruction. I mean, suppose that, a butterfly flaps his wings and through some kind of chaotic effect that brings about a typhoon which causes massive amounts of suffering. I would think that the evil would be the suffering, not the butterfly flapping its wings.
I agree. It shouldn't be the butterfly. How much? So it has to be, if I'm right, is it the pain, suffering itself? Or is it the event causing it? It's got to be, if it is the event causing the loss, pain, and suffering, it's got to be sort of fairly proximate to the pain and suffering, not something on the other side of the world like the butterfly, right? So I'm still thinking.
Well, I mean, let's just talk about the typhoon.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that you could say, well, the typhoon is maybe instrumentally evil, but what's intrinsically evil is the pain and suffering. And if you just define it as an event that brings about the suffering, then I think you're missing that.
I guess maybe I'm thinking of cases where we say modern medicine has ameliorated these three great evils, yellow fever, typhus, and so we sort of name diseases, and those diseases we think of as the evils, and those in turn cause the suffering. So I think that's the kind of linguistic case, but I'll have to think more about it. You see what I'm saying with the yellow fever there?
Yeah.
But that's more kind of intrinsically involves the pain and suffering. A typhoon doesn't. It could land on some isolated beach, and then it wouldn't be an evil at all. So you want to locate the evil too right in the events of the suffering and loss, not in the proximate physical cause of it. I see that, yeah.
Dustin.
So I thought that paper was really interesting. I agreed with everything until Artsky stopped talking, but including the parts where you were talking in the beginning. But Sam asked a question that was quite similar to what I was going to ask, so I am going to second Sam's question and maybe expand on it a little more. I don't see that there's any helpful analogy between Bergman's position and the subjectivist consequentialists. Because, I mean, what expected utility is a sort of probabilistic calculation, right? We take, like, what would be the consequences, and then we multiply it times the probability that this happens, right? So if I'm really doing an expected utility calculation of the sort that people who believe in basing moral actions on expected utility calculations typically want me to do, if Bergman is right about my epistemic status, what I'll say is, look, I'm aware of these reasons. They're not at all representative of my actual reasons. And so my expected utility chart is going to look like action A, inscrutable, action B, utility inscrutable, action C, expected utility inscrutable. And I'm in just as hopeless a situation as Artsky thinks that I am. So I think, I think that if there's a way to reconcile what the sort of decision procedure that Bergman wants me to undergo with the sort of decision procedures, if there's a way to reconcile what Bergman wants me to do with consequentialism, it's going to be by introducing like a decision procedure that I don't know of any consequentialists having endorsed. It's going to be one where I go based on reasons that I'm aware of, even when I don't take those to be representative of what will actually happen. And that's, I don't think, one that subjective consequentialists are going to be happy about.
So, one of the papers I didn't get a chance to study for this, but it's on my desk, is a paper by Fred Feldman, 2006, and he argues that Francis Howard Snyder and others are mistaken in thinking that if you're an objective utilitarian, it seems like really hard to figure out the right thing to do, but if you become a subjective utilitarian, it'll become easier. And Feldman argues, some people have told me really well that that's not true. And it sounds sort of similar to what you're saying. There's stuff to think about. But how'd that work? I mean, I guess here's how, say you're this nurse and you're caring for this, these little infants, and how do you say that?
Obstetrician.
Yeah, that ward of the hospital. I can't say it. You just had a little baby. How do you say
Obstetrics.
that? I still can't say it. And
The OB-GYN.
the OB-GYN ward. It is late.
The maternity ward?
Yeah, the maternity ward. That's what I want. The maternity ward. Thanks. So you're caring for this little baby, and space is limited, and you can either put her in this nice warm room or this one, and that's the decision you face. And this one, there's another little baby with a kind of cough. There's a risk of infection. This one, there's another little baby with, I don't know, typhus or something. And you think about it, typhus is a lot less contagious than the little cough under the conditions you've got her, but it's a lot worse if she gets it. And those are the main goods you see for either one. And then there's going to be maybe tons of goods you have no way of knowing, or tons of evils you have no way of knowing. And Bergman says, well, if you have no way of knowing about them, they may be actual consequences of your action, but you don't have to worry about them. They're not part of the procedure. You just have to focus on the goods and evils that you know. And then what we add to that as Christians is make sure they're the goods and evils God cares about and wants you to care about too. So that's sort of the new part. But why? I'm thinking just that if you don't have to worry about actual consequences to which you have no actions because they're irrelevant to the moral rightness or wrongness of the action or of what you morally ought to do, you're saying, well, you won't be able to figure that out any better. On that basis, you won't be able to figure out what you ought to do any more than a person who says, no, you've got to know all the good and bad consequences and take it all into account. How does that go? Why is it?
The thought is going to be, if I don't believe the skeptical premise, which I think typically people who want me to make decisions based on expected utility don't believe the skeptical premise. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say, look, these are factors that I'm aware of. These are factors that I'm not aware of. There might be other factors, these are factors that I'm aware of that count for doing it. These are factors I'm aware of that don't count for doing it, or that count against doing it. There might be other factors that I'm not aware of that count for or against doing it, but that's a wash. It is likely to go one way rather than the other. So probabilistically, it's fine for me to think that the reasons I'm aware of are representative of the reasons that there are, like the objective reasons that there are, the goods that there are in this situation. And so I can make like good probability judgments and probability judgments that are likely to like in some way reflect reality, right? But that's not possible if I accept Bergman's skeptical premise. Then what I do is I say, look, here are the reasons that I'm aware of for doing it. Here are the reasons that I'm aware of against doing it. I have no idea. This tells me nothing whatsoever about what's probably going to happen long term. So then when I try to plug this into the formula that I use to get expected utility, I just put in question marks where there are supposed to be numbers, and I get expected utility fray, inscrutable, expected utility, and it doesn't help me at all. I say, well, the R.
Okay, I see. Yeah, I don't think that. That's interesting. If that's how the subjective utilitarian is thinking, why she just needs to confine herself to the things she has access to, because all the things she don't, it's a wash, as you put it. It could blow one way or the other, and therefore, the things she's aware of are in some way a semi-reliable glimpse into which way those go. I think that's really bad. If that's, I like my defense of subjective utility a lot better.
I'll stop talking after this.
Yeah,
the thought is,
look,
if I make a decision based on the reasons that I'm familiar with, and these are a good guide to what's really going to happen, it would be like awfully unfair for me if just through bad luck, something really improbable happened that had bad consequences, and then I acted wrongly. That doesn't seem right.
Yeah. Well,
so
they're
I need to
a
act
good
based
guy.
on probabilities, but for Berkman, I can't even assign probabilities. I have no way to do an expected utility calculation. It just comes out. I do whatever.
Well, you can assign it, in the nurse case, you can assign a utility calculation to the things you know about, the typhus and the cold, and then there's all these things you can't, and those are out of the picture, and you don't form any conclusion about them. Then there's the rationale question. Well, why even care about the things you can see if they don't represent the total? And that's what I was addressing in the last part of the paper, doing a theistic rationale for it. So, thank you.
Ready?
Yep.
Okay, so I wondered whether your defense didn't give rise to a sort of new problem of evil. And it would go something like this. So I take it that the skeptical theist says that the horrible things that happen in the world don't show that there's no benevolent God, because there are goods beyond our ken that are produced by them, or might well be produced by them. And you say, right, that God wants us to act on the basis of the foreseeable consequences with respect to the goods that we do understand, so that are not beyond our ken. And then it seems, I wondered the following. So since we have no insight into the relation between our acts that are based on such calculations with respect to the goods that we do get and the production of goods beyond our ken, it seems that God then wants us to perform acts that at least sometimes prevent various very important goods that are beyond our ken from being realized. I just wondered, why would that be sort of compatible with God's being infinitely benevolent and something like that?
Okay, so on that, the key sentence was there, the on the account I'm giving, it seems that God would sometime want us to be doing things, doing actions that
Prevent.
they promote the goods, they do promote goods he cares about that we can see, but they may actually get in the way of these unknown goods and kind of impede his purposes and make it harder for him. Well, I guess I just think he's big enough to handle that.
Bruce.
So I'm going to say what I think epistemic justification is in general, then apply it to the problem of evil eventually. So to me, justification has to do, epistemic justification, it has an aim, it's to get the truth, unlike pragmatic justification, something else. And when you're justified, you're responsibly pursuing the truth, and that means fitting your beliefs to the evidence. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot of different areas where we could talk about, well, should we believe that there's extraterrestrial intelligence or not? Or should we add a big column of numbers, long numbers, many of them? Should we believe that the answer is whatever? Should we believe that this is the right action to do in the circumstances? And depending on what our total evidence that we possess is, or maybe we should possess, we might have to go out and look some, but then we form beliefs, and we should either, I don't know, relative to the total evidence, believe P, or disbelieve it, or suspend judgment. And I think in the case of, you give of Hyper Sally, isn't that her name?
Hyper Sally.
It's a kind of suspend judgment. You don't really know. It's like maybe in the extraterrestrial case, at least sometime in the world, the evidence didn't kind of point one way or the other. Maybe it's kind of sloping. There is extraterrestrial intelligence, the more planets we hear about, whatever. But it does seem to be the alternatives: believe, disbelieve, or suspend judgment to the total evidence. So I look around and I try to, different areas I have to do different things to be responsible to the evidence or gather evidence. I have to carefully check my addition and the addition problem and read the relevant scientists on the extraterrestrial issue and so forth. And in the moral problems, I have to think hard about things and what would justify this and what wouldn't. And sometimes you have to suspend judgment. But other times it seems like, wow, I thought really hard about this and I can't see how a good parent who had the power to prevent this and knew it was happening would allow it to occur. I've thought of all the possible reasons that might justify allowing it to occur, a good parent, and I can't. And so I think I should believe a good parent would not. And then somebody says to me, yeah, but what if there were some other being, that had more knowledge that you had? And it's kind of like in the skeptical scenario about non-normative things. Yeah, you think that the addition is X, but what if there were an evil demon who made you make mistakes in addition, and so you were always, or nearly always, getting the wrong answer? And to that I say, well, it's true if there were, this condition was true. If there were an evil demon, he would be causing me to make these mistakes, but I shouldn't doubt my addition unless I have independent reason to believe there's an evil demon. In the same way, when I've been thought hard about a moral issue and can't see how, God would allow all this suffering because a good parent wouldn't, as far as I can tell, by talking to other people and thinking hard about it. And somebody says, but here's a condition that's true. If God exists, probably there are lots of connections and goods that you're not aware of and so forth that may justify allowing this to happen. And I say I completely agree with the conditional, as I do in the evil demon case. But unless you have some independent reason to believe there's an evil demon, I'm justified in believing that sum of these numbers is X. And similarly, unless you have independent reason for believing there is a God of the sort that the conditional specifies, I should believe what I do on the basis of my reflections. And the reason your good parent analogy doesn't work, I think, is because the child does have independent reason to believe there's a parent and that parent has treated them in a loving way in the past. So if you have independent reason to believe God exists, then I should be skeptical. But if you don't, I'm just like I am in the skeptical situation with the evil demon about non-moral, non-normative matters.
It sounds like you're bringing in it sounds like you're inviting me to kind of discuss the logic of, or illogic of skeptical theist responses at this point. But you haven't connected, years ago we've talked about that, so I'm eager to return to those, but I don't see where it's connecting to the topic of this paper, I guess, or to any of the contentions I've made in this paper. Is it, or are you inviting me to pursue?
It is, because it's relevant to the analogy you have about subjective and objective utilitarianism. I agree that subjective utilitarianism should be characterized or couched in terms of what is reasonable to believe about the utilities, not about probabilities in terms of frequencies or something like that. That's not going to get you the relevant analogy. But the relevant analogy is, well, people think that it's reasonable to believe sometimes that this action produces the most utility, and hence, if you're utilitarian, it's the thing you ought to do. And then somebody might say, but wait a second, how come you think that produces, it's reasonable to believe it produces the most utility? I mean, for all you know, that something awful in 2,000 years will happen, because you did this action today. So really, if you're a subjective utilitarianist, I think the way we're both understanding that, you are not justified in holding any moral views. You should suspend judgment about rightness and wrongness completely.
We'll just have to engage that some other time. I can't find an issue I can have a thoughtful response to, Bruce, so thanks.
Okay, so suppose I got through most of that paper and got to the point where we'd gotten through the hiker case and all of that. And then at the very end of the paper, well, we need a theistic response. I could jump off and say, okay, we'll see, jump off, this is why we should all just be deontologists, go straight divine command theory, because then we're doing, we'll know all the time that we're doing what God wants, and that doing what God wants according to the rules he's laid out is what makes us better. Now, I think, if I presented that argument to the atheist, the response would be pretty much, you've got to be kidding. I don't want to go into divine command theory, merits and demerits thereof. But my worry is that the same sort of worries about divine command theory that a lot of people have could apply to this thing as well. Except instead of asking, well, why did God give us these rules? What makes it not just arbitrary? Why couldn't he have given us other rules? We're going to start asking, well, why did he give us these goods? Why not let us access more goods? Why isn't there just sort of an arbitrariness? Why should I accept that these goods that God has given me access to are, the best, even if I didn't even understand best, sensibly without access to a full set of goods? I'm sorry, it's a little
No, I see what you're
but
saying. Yeah. I don't think the response would be, you got to be kidding, to bringing in, well, God gives us these commands, and being moral means following them. I don't think there would be, you got to be kidding, at least just because, by virtue or vice of the fact you're appealing to divine command theory. It would rather be, well, so I think in the dialogue with the people I'm in, including non-theists, atheists, it's not that they would think a Christian theist philosopher can't rely on divine command theory. It's that the argument in this case, I think when Bergman is setting up the threat, why people think skeptical theism will lead to moral skepticism, he picks that class of neuter actions, ones that God doesn't give us any commands about, precisely because divine command theory won't help you with those. So the Artsky, the attacker, picks that class and he says, you Christians, yeah, you can have your divine command theory, and so you're going to not commit adultery and, be promiscuous and things like that because God has told you not to. But here's a class of actions, and you also make moral decisions about this class, and there are no commands bearing on it. But you still make moral decisions about them. And you won't be able to do that if you're a skeptical theist. And so you bringing in divine command theory, but still, and so what I do bring in, though, is that I bring in, what should we call it, divine good theory. That is, that just as God gives us certain commands, even more importantly, God tells us what to care about. Okay? And I guess he does that by commands, like, love one another.
Yeah,
right?
because I'm contrasting like divine command theory, don't commit adultery because, at least a naive, don't commit adultery because I said so, which I admit is a very naive, I'm not an ethicist.
Yeah.
Version 2, say a natural law framework, well, don't commit adultery because this this sort of union is a human good and tends towards these other goods. I suppose you could work that in as well. I've lost myself now. But
Right. So, but that's helpful. I think that both for the norms we follow, the do's and don'ts, whether we can put in moral rules, and our sense of what goods is really important to care about in life, to be pursuing as part of our life vision and our calling. For both of those things, I think we rely both on a kind of general revelation that God has given us, so natural law fits in with that, and on this special revelation that supplements it, that comes through Jesus and the teachers God has sent us. And part of all that is a reasonable reliance on authority that we've got some good reason to think is authoritative. So we shouldn't be afraid of being authoritarian personalities and thinking, I'm not doing it because God told me not to. I'm going to try and care about this because I think Jesus told me to. That's okay, even for philosophers. Right?
We have 4 minutes and time for one more question. And you were next.
I just had a question about how you were using the Pauline trolley line. Let's not do evil that good may result. When you considered we could do this small, seemingly evil thing in order for a good net moral result. I might have just misunderstood you, but it seemed like you were saying if what results is a net moral result, then the action that we did previously wasn't really evil. It's trivial in comparison. Which, if that is what you said, then that makes it seem like you can do an evil just as long as you anticipate a net moral result, and then that seems to just say that the ends justify the means, anyways.
Yes. That's right. When in cases that look like exceptions to the Pauline principle, where you're doing something that brings about some harm, like throwing that switch to let the, I hate trolley cases. They're like hiker salad cases. I don't even like to think about them, but that in those cases where the maybe the pain, the loss isn't trivial, but there's a good perhaps for another person that far outweighs it. In those cases that are what Jim calls exceptions, the good is sufficient to make the action not a morally evil action. So my point, and it's kind of a trivial semantic point, is we shouldn't think of those as exceptions, and we shouldn't think of them as showing that the Pauline principle isn't an absolute principle. I don't think it's wrong to lie as an absolute principle. I think there's cases where it's morally right to lie. If the Nazis are at your door and you're hiding Anne Frank's family, it's okay to tell them. I haven't seen any strangers around. I don't think that is, but I think the Pauline principle is an absolute principle. It doesn't have exceptions. It's always more. We should never do morally wrong actions in order that you'll get into graduate school, or if the good is good enough to justify the action, it's got to be good enough to make it no longer morally wrong.
Well, that took half the time I predicted, so Jim, go ahead.
Yeah, I still don't understand anything you said, how you're responding to my general problem, that is we don't want to just look at these actions that the morality is determined by the consequences, the neutral actions but the real interesting set of actions that we want to look at is the ones that are being set aside here. That is, the actions that are at least prima facie intrinsically wrong. And the issue is, those are things we can have quite a knowledge about. It's not, so we don't have to worry about, and these are things that are wrong, not because of the consequences. They're intrinsically wrong. And the question is, it could be that the problem of evil, it could be helpfully worked out just with respect to those actions. So we don't have to get into the consequentials. We don't have to go down that route. We have to just focus on actions, the actions of intrinsically wrong things. And I'm particularly bringing in here that failing to help in certain cases, failing to prevent other things that are intrinsically wrong are also intrinsically wrong. And once you make that move, once you make the move that failing to prevent an intrinsically wrong action is itself intrinsically wrong, then you got a class of actions that start to look like they're very relevant to the problem of evil.
Yeah, okay, so that's the guy firing the rocket at me, right? I didn't know I was supposed to respond to your thing.
Oh, well, you had choice. Didn't I tell you you had choice?
Shoot. And you gave it to me before.
Yeah, way before. No, not way before.
It was today, wasn't it?
Yeah, but you get your kind of
so I'm so glad you're last.
Ago.
Thanks. And we talked about it over dinner a little bit
Yeah,
too.
but I didn't
Thanks.
get an answer there either.
Okay, great. So I think the problem of evil, it's like a house, it's like Jesus' house with many mansions in it. And you're right in the main mansion. You want us to go back into the main ballroom.
Yeah.
And in that case, there's these events that occur in the world. They're horrific. And if I were there or you were there, you would, you see three guys who are assaulting a woman, and you would hope you'd just plunge in at the risk of your own life, if need be, and stop it.
And if I had superhuman powers, I would.
And you would.
Yes.
And so how can we get God off the hook? And I agree. I agree. The problem of evil, the place, that's where the severest problems come if we want to try and make sense of why God allows all this crud. But the house also has these other side rooms. And one of them is just a complicated argument that skeptical theism doesn't work because it leads to moral skepticism. And the main argument for that little house rests upon considering neuter actions and whether we're going to have to be moral skeptics about those if we're skeptical theists. So I have to deal with those, and if we can close that door and lock it, we can go back to your room.
Okay.
That's how I'm thinking.
That sounds
You're
good.
thinking I'm in the main room. I'm not. I'm up in this side room.
Well, I just want to make sure we understand how big the house is here.
Well, yeah, it's a big house, and this is a small room in it.
No, it's a big room.
It's my room.
You made it.
Let's thank our speakers.